Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Chapter 8, Halacha 1. We have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what is leket, where is leket, what is a field, but now we're going to talk about when this takes effect. You think to yourself, well, I know when this takes effect. But chapter 8 comes along and says, aha, I'm going to make it even more refined for you. So the Mishnah comes along and says, from when are all people permitted to take leket? From when an elderly poor person has gone through the field. And when are all people permitted to take peret and alelos of grapes? From when the poor go through the vineyard and return. And when are all poor people permitted to take the shkika of olives? From when the second rains fall. So there's going to be an opposing view to that. Rabbi Yehuda says, but are there not those who do not harvest their olives until after the second rains? So then how can the wealthy take the forgotten olives at any time after the rains? And it continues, and it says, rather, they are permitted from when the available gifts have diminished to the extent that a poor person who goes out cannot bring back 4 Issachar's worth. So let's unpack this. So this is now going to be talking about this legal mechanism by which the gifts become permitted to the wealthy. So, we've been talking about who, what, when, where, how. Okay, so this is going to be talking about when does this become, and basically the first word of chapter 8's Mishnah is metai. It's talking about basically from when. All right, and so basically, this is going to be talking about, when is it permitted for now even the rich people to take leket from a field? And the Mishnah is going to specify leket only as a hekish, like an illustration, but it's going to apply to other gifts as well, like shikha and peah. And the Tosfot Yom Tov says about this Mishnah that the Mishnah addresses leket because it could be scattered all over a field, and it would be, more easily missed by collectors than peah, which is concentrated in one area, or shkika, which is bundled up into sheaves. So that's a really good question. Now, when can the rich people come and gather it? So basically it says, once the elderly poor have passed through the field in search of their gifts, the assumption is that there's nothing left in the field to be collected, for the elderly who are bent over and leaning on their canes can see everything that's left on the ground and take it. So this, by the way, you're going to see how elegant this halacha is and how this Mishnah is and why it's so necessary. So it's evident in the Bavli and Baba Metzia 21b that gifts become permitted through yush. In other words, people have abandoned it. And this classical application of this principle comes back with returning a lost object. So once there's yush, there's, and the owner basically has given up hope of recovering it, and it's out there in a field, the poor people basically have ownership and they come to look for it and basically stopped. Okay, so now it's like they have yush, and so whatever's left is now ownerless and permitted to anyone. Anyone. That also means rich people, because as we know, Bet Hillel, Bet Shammai, Bet Hillel says you can't make hekdesh just from. You're not allowed to leave ownerless property and just say it's only for the poor. It has to be for everybody. It has to be truly for everybody. So that also means rich. So So once the poor, even for parrot and the gifts from the grapes, go through the vineyard, and then they come back a second time, and they look, and then they're finished, that's it. They effectively have yush. So what is so amazing about this is they're basically saying, hey, wait a second, right? The the owner of the field has to get back to work, has to get back to production. And there, if this had the halachic status of parrot or had the halachic status of leket, and it starts to get intermingled with other stuff on the field, you could a lot of things could happen. First of all, the poor could keep coming back and saying, "Oh, it's been 3 months. I'm coming to look for a leket," and the farmer's saying, "What are you doing? I'm hoeing the field. Get out of here. You're ruining my planting." So there's a limit on when it's cut off, right? So the cutoff is when the poor people are coming back to come and check, and after this second time, it's like they've given up and they've collected everything they're going to do. But the neatness of this is that, and the precision of this is that this now switches switches ownership again, and this switches back to being owned by everybody. So the rich person, the owner of the field, allowed to pick it up. What else is important about this is that if it does get acquired, it doesn't have this connection of being owned by someone else. So that you can't come along with a case where you say, "Oh, my pile of grain now has 1 ear of leket in it, and I can't figure out what's what, and I'm having a hard time cleaning this up." And you're saying, no, 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 in this case, that this pile of grain gets put down here, and there was leket that was there, but they have yush, and that now is done. Guess what? You don't have a problem with your pile of grain anymore, because it's not leket anymore. Now it's ownerless. So it's lost that status. So what it's doing is it's allowing the farmer to come back and actually do his work without being interrupted in the field by people coming forever looking for leket, even though it's unreasonable that there would be any, or it'd be very insignificant. And the other part about it is that if something were to get mixed up, that it's not mixed up at all, because it's getting mixed up with something ownerless. And once the person picks it up, once the farmer picks it up, he's acquired it inside of that pile. So it's not any problem at all. So you need this in order to fix it, because you're saying that, oh, I have an issue of it becoming property of the poor in the beginning of this farming, harvesting event. But what about after? What about when he's got to come and get to work now? And now the halacha is coming along, and the elegance and the brilliance of this is coming along and saying, after this harvesting event, after they're coming through, after the rains, okay, after all this stuff has happened, and they are effectively having yush, they're effectively stopped from doing it anymore or being crazy about it, right? They've come and they've collected everything, and now it triggers back to this ownerlessness. And so now you're getting out of all these halachic problems of having mixed produce with two different owners in it, because basically the mechanism that triggers that is this idea of yush, that the person comes to look for his owner, he's an owner for something, he's coming to look for his thing, and then basically after that time has elapsed, yush comes in, and now it's the property of everyone. And that is what is so clever about this. Now we're going to get into more things about the two Issachars, and we're going to get into Rabbi Yehuda's dispute with the Tanakama, and we're gonna dig into this more. But I just want to show to you how elegant this is. What this is trying to do is trying to come up with all these cases with the olives, the grapes, and the grain, where the poor people have already collected the gifts by a certain time. And basically, you could argue, like what Rabbi Yehuda is doing. You're saying, like, well, when is that time? Is it going to be when the second rains fall? Is it going to be when you have a different time of when it could fall? But that's not the point, right? The point is that the Gemara is going to try to link it to when the poor have gone through the field, and when that turns off, and when does that ownership now switch to where it becomes available to everybody. And that's what's really so brilliant about chapter 8, Halacha 1's Mishnah. So we're going to get into this Mishnah that's, going to be talking about the Namoshos. And here's what the Gemara says about it. There's going to be two names for this. And these are going to be names and words for these kinds of people that are actually in the Tanakh itself. So Rabbi Yochanan said, why are the elderly called Namoshos? And he says, because they come at the end after the younger collectors have already left. And a variation of the term Namoshos is Abba Sha'al would call them Mamoshos. So let's take a look at this, because this is going to be something from the in the Torah itself. So basically, says Amara Fulda, because the elderly move slowly, they come at a time at the end of the collecting period. In other words, there's other people that are faster and younger, and they're coming first. So Yamish means remove, and that is going to be in the term of basically like Hashem did not remove Lo Yamish, the pillar of the cloud. That's in Exodus when the Jews were leaving; they had the cloud over them. And so basically what he's saying is that they do not arrive until after all the other poor people have been removed from the field. So another way to look at it from the Sidei Yeshua could be that alternatively, once they complete their collection, the field is as thoroughly cleaned out so that the other poor people are removed from coming to the field. So Namashot is gonna have this root of Yamish, and being like that either the case is that all the other people are removed, and basically like they're the last ones left, or it's going to be like that when the cleaning happens, that the field is going to be so completed the collection that other poor people, even if they're older and slower, are going to be removed from the field, because they're basically going to be like, I was late, there's nothing left. So that's how you get that. The Gemara is going to explain this term mashoshos, mashosos in a little bit further along in the Gemara. The Gemara is going to teach two versions about the Mishnah, and it's going to say that there are some Tanaim who teach that from when the Namoshos go through the field, as it says in this Mishnah, and there's other Tanaim who teach from when the Mamoshos, and the one who says Namoshos stated so because they come at the end when everyone else has left, and the one who says Mamoshos stated so because they feel their way along. So the Vilna, Chaim Kanievsky says in his Beur series, he says that the elderly are referred to Mamoshos because they basically feel, and that's Mashesh, where it's like they're feeling things, like they're prodding along by feeling the walls, or they're feeling the ground with their canes or something like that. There's some system of like bumping along. So you have this real sense of somebody being very, very old and trying to be, feeling their way because they're very impaired. Either they're impaired or they're blind or infirmed. And it's interesting because there's two versions of this Mishnah, and as we see that one writes it one way, one writes it the other way. Both terms, by the way, are used in the Tanakh. As mentioned, one is used in terms of the cloud in Exodus 13:22, and the other one is related to the word feel, where you can see in Tehillim 115:7. So there is a scriptural term, and then when it's saying Tanaim, it could refer to somebody from the Mishnah period that's an actual Tana, but it could also refer to somebody who was an Amora that memorized the exact wording of what the Tanaim actually taught and recite them, verbatim to assembled students. So that's why the text is using Tanaim. It might be Tanaim, but it might also be actual Amorim, but their role was that they were passing on the oral tradition. And the Gemara now is going to cite the practice of a Tana who collected gifts to the poor. In other words, that there was an actual Tana who was very, very poor, and he used to come out and collect these gifts. So Rabbi Huna, in the name of Menachem, said, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who, by the way, is a pretty famous Tana, would go out among the elderly collectors and bring back his sustenance for the entire year. And Pnei Moshe says that this teaches us that even these last collectors can bring back a large amount of produce, at which point the other poor give up hope of finding anything. So the idea here is that you have the poor coming out in multiple steps. And I want to take a look at how the Rambam addresses this from his commentary in the Mishnah. You can also find that over there in Hilchos Matanos Aniyim 1:11. So he's saying, the Rambam says, both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish agree that the gifts become permitted only after the second wave of gleaners have gone through the field. And Rabbi Yochanan maintains that the Mishnah uses the elderly as a borrowed term, like an example, because the elderly generally represent the second wave of the gleaners. That's what this is trying to teach. So that what we see from this story about Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is that even the second wave can still collect stuff. But beyond that, people basically are going to be giving up hope that they're going to find anything, because the people are going to be pretty thorough to pick through and collect all the Peah, to collect all the leket and everything else. So there's going to be a related Bryce, and here's what it teaches. Gemara says, a Bryce taught, gifts for the poor in the field that the poor do not care about belong to the owner of the field. Well, that seems very very curious, because how could a rich person that owned the field collect Peah from his own field? How can that work? What's going on there? This could refer to, says the Pnei Moshe, inferior types of produce that the poor did not bother to collect. That could be one way to look at it. Even if the owner is wealthy, says Arash Cirilio, he may take this produce before the time stated in the Mishnah for the reason the Gemara is going to state below. Here's what the Gemara says. The Gemara ponders and wonders and says, Rabbi Bon Barhia inquired, but does one declare Peah for himself? In other words, how can the owner declare produce to be Peah because it belongs to the poor, and then he just takes it for himself? So how could that be? And here's an answer by Shimon Bar Yochai. The Gemara answers it. Shimon Bar Yochai taught a brisa. The verse states, Leviticus 19:10, it says, for the poor and for the convert you shall leave them, implying, but not for the ravens and the bats. In other words, what Shimon Bar Yochai is saying, how could it be that the gifts for the poor could go back to the owner of the field, and where it falls into this category of that, that the poor do not care about? Basically, what he's saying is that you don't have an obligation to leave these to rot. You don't have these obligation to leave these for rodents or bats or birds, and these can still have value. And if the poor is too far for if the field is too far for the poor to reach it, and nobody is coming, and like today, nobody observes these laws, so they don't need to leave it, because again, they would be leaving it out to rot. it's not the custom today for people to come and collect it. So because of that, the owner is allowed to take the gifts because nobody is doing this. And I want to point out by the Rambam in Hilchos Matanos Aniyim, chapter 1, Halacha 10, and he's going to be saying like this. Okay, here's how he explains it. He says that this exemption of leaving gifts to the poor applies once the produce has been declared as gifts to the poor. It is not, however, an exemption from the basic requirement to set aside pay and other gifts to the poor. For the verse teaches only that if the poor are not taking the gifts, like, by the way, what we have today, that were set aside for them, at that point the owner may take the produce for himself. Thus, the owner must first declare the produce as Peah, and then may take it for himself. This ruling has additional significance with regard to Meiser, for since the produce of this field is subject to the gifts of the poor and attains the status of halachic, shiurim, and Peah, they are exempt from the tithing requirement, like all gifts to the poor. So that's a good point. You're not required to take this and leave it out for bats and rodents. You're leaving it for poor, and if the poor aren't coming collecting it, the owner's allowed to come and take it. But like what the Rambam's pointing out, he has to make that designation that is for the poor, but he's allowed to come and recollect it. But if it's the custom that the people are coming and doing it, he can't just do that and reclaim it. He's not allowed to. So the Gemara continues, and it talks about the next part of the Mishnah. And so the Gemara is going to say, when is everyone permitted to take parrot and olelos from when the poor go through the field and return? And the Gemara asks, but was it not taught earlier in the Mishnah that the time is based on the elderly collectors? So why should the grapes be different? And the Gemara is going to answer it. It says, since grapes are cherished, the poor come immediately. So basically what this is saying, says the Pnei Moshe, is that the Mishnah does not link the time when grapes are permitted to the collection of the elderly, but instead to when the poor go through the vineyard and return. So basically, even if the elderly come immediately, right, the point is that the elderly tend to come in this second wave, but everybody's going to be coming because there's a value to grapes, because you can use it to make grape juice or wine, which you can use for kiddush. And maybe it was hard to get bottles of wine, but it guarantees that people in Eretz Yisrael could at least get some wine for kiddush, because you can make a rivas. So the Gemara is going to quote the next section of the Mishnah, but just I really want to point out how important it is to look at this part, from when do the poor go through the vineyard and return. And really I want to highlight this idea that the grapes are valued, and the people are going to rush to come very quickly to come collect the gifts for the poor from the grapes. And so people know where the vineyards are. They know who has it. They know the field, the location, and they know the basic time of when the harvesting occurs, because you can see the people harvesting in the field. So this is something where even though you have elderly collectors who might be coming a little bit later, still people are going to rush pretty quickly, and it's going to get picked up pretty quickly. So after that point, what's going to be left, it's that period of time might be very, very short, and it might be shorter than, say, like an olive tree, or in a field of grain, because the people really, they want to make sure they have wine for kiddush and things like that. And so they'll be very quick, even if they're old and slow, to go to those fields first and collect it. So again, those fields might be subject to this law much quicker than other kinds of fields. So the Gemara now talks about the next part of the Mishnah, and it says, and when is everyone permitted to take shkika of olives? From when the second rains fall. So the Gemara says, but was it not taught earlier in the Mishnah, by the time that the time is based on the elderly collectors. So why should olives be any different? And the Gemara is going to answer. And it's going to say, for the days of olive harvest are cold, and only young people go out to collect shkika. Therefore, the Tanakama of the Mishnah cannot link the permissibility of olives to collection of the elderly, and therefore he links it to the second rains. So the Pnei Moshe says like this about this idea. It says that the olive harvest took place in the late autumn when it's already cold. And the Mishnah, therefore, does not establish the time in terms of the elderly poor like we did for the grain field or for the vineyard, because the elderly poor do not collect olive gifts due to the cold weather. And the Rosh says that this law only applies to olive trees and not other fruit trees that are harvested earlier in the year. So there's a special thing going on here about the nature of harvesting the olive trees that is done at a much later date, and the poor old people don't want to risk getting sick, so they're not going to go out and collect it at that time. So it's going to be left to the second rains, and then that's going to be the cutoff point which younger poor people have to collect this. In other words, that instead of using the measuring rod as elderly poor, once they come and do it, they're just saying that by the second rain, the case is going to be different because the young people don't mind going out in the cold to go collect this, and they're just going to put an arbitrary cutoff, because you can't say that, well, we need to have a time for a second wave, because there might not be waves of younger people doing it. So when should be the cutoff, right? You could argue that you need to have a cutoff time, because otherwise people will start coming more frequently, and maybe what'll happen is it could get into the way of work, or it could get into the way where people are trespassing on the field. So you need to have a time when everybody can know, and when the second rains are, so everybody knows second rains happen then, and it creates a sense of urgency. Now we get into the final passage of the Mishnah, and Rabbi Yudah said, rather, they are permitted from when the poor person who goes out cannot bring back 4 Issachar's worth. So the Gemara asks, and it says, and if there's less than that amount, is it not forbidden under the prohibition of theft? And so it's basically like implying that, yeah, it's certainly going to be forbidden to take that lesser amount from the poor as well. So Rosh is saying Rabbi Yudah follows the same line of reasoning that Tanakama have. And they're saying that Tanakama holds that since the elderly do not go out to collect olives because of the cold, the olives become permissible as soon as the second rains fall, since the poor will no longer trouble themselves with olives, despite the possibility that some olives might be left. So too, says Rabbi Yudah, even when the young people will not go out, when they will be unable to collect a day's supply, the poor relinquish their rights to any olives at that point, and the gifts are thus not subject to the prohibition of theft. Rabbi Yudah answered the sages according to the following reasoning. It says, does this not conform with your own approach? For you have said that because it is cold, only the young go out. And we can then similarly say that because a poor person knows that he will not be able to bring his support, in other words, 4 Issachar's worth of food to cover both his own and his wife's daily needs, he too will not go out. So, we're talking about, a young person who, if they can't get enough to sustain themselves on it, is just not going to bother. They're just gonna ignore it. And so at that point, there might be some that's left, but it's so trivial that people are not going to take the time to go walk to the field to go find it and collect it, and it will revert at that point back to being ownerless, and then the field owner can make an acquisition and acquire it. Another thing I want to point out with the olive harvest, this cold weather, they're using the weather itself to be an indicator on when this cutoff is. So here's the deal, right? You're allowed, once you have the second rains fall, you're allowed to go and pick them. Okay, but before the rains fall, okay, you're not allowed to. It's still in the property of the owner because you could still be harvesting it. But the poor person can see when the first rains are. They can see when the second rains are, and what's going to happen is they're gonna hurry up then because that's going to be when this becomes available, and they're going to even though it's very cold and old people aren't going to want to go, that there's going to be a rush to go get them. A lot of people are going to be able to see with this siman that the second rain occurred, and that you can go to this big olive field now, and it's your turn to go collect it. So that's an important point.